give us some further Torah study this morning and some insights into our parasha.
Shabbat Shalom and a very warm welcome to our visitors from Israel. ברוכים הבאים מכל הלב. אני מאוד מצטער שלא יצא לי להיות כאן אתמול בערב, להכיר אתכם אז, ואני מקווה שתבינו את האנגלית שאני אדבר בה עכשיו, אם לא תשאלו אותי אחרי בקידוש. Where are you from? But where are you really from? But where is your family from? I guess you've all had your fill of this persistent questioning repeated across the media for the past week, as well as the recipient's response that it was abuse. I won't go into the specific incident, except to say that I don't agree that it amounts to violence, as has been suggested, because there's always room for doubt about the motivation behind such questioning, but there can be no doubt about the motivation behind a punch on the nose. In this country, such questions are not exclusively addressed to people of color. I'm sure I'm not alone here in having been asked them often when introduced to strangers, who sometimes tell me by way of explanation, that's not exactly an English name, as if I didn't know. When I reply that I was born in Swiss Cottage, the follow-up comes, okay, but where was your family from? Now I usually anticipate that by jumping in first to explain that my father was a refugee from the Nazis. Such questioning can be irritating, but that depends entirely on the context. In Israel, where most Jews have recent origins in so many different places, the question is entirely normal. Although even there, prejudice between different communities can make it loaded. Olim, who were simply Jews in the countries they left, become Iraqis, Russians, Moroccans, or in our case, actually Anglo-Saxons in Israel, although of course Germans remain Yekes. Prejudices aside, what does it matter where anybody comes from? Well, it seems to matter to us, and we take an exceptionally long view. After 2,000 years of diaspora, we are still fixated upon a small area of land in the Eastern Mediterranean, much of it either rocky or desert or both. Jacob would have been asked this question by Rachel at the well. He'd come from what was then still Canaan, where he was a second-generation immigrant, but if he'd been asked where he really came from, where his family came from, the answer would have been right there in Haran, as he'd returned to his people to seek a bride. Having found not one but two, in the end he asks Laban to let him and his household go back to Canaan. Jacob becomes Israel, and we and the land have borne his name ever since. In the Torah account, Israel's attachment to the land at that stage only lasted a generation before initially voluntary exile and subsequent enslavement in Egypt. It was there, we are told, in conditions of slavery, that a nomad clan became a nation, eventually released, returning to Canaan, and over a period of centuries, building a kingdom that again lasted only a short time before splitting in two. One after another, these were overthrown, and their elites once again found themselves in exile, this time in Babylon. Returned eventually, but never really secure, and always sharing the country with other peoples, worshipping other gods, their descendants fell prey first to Greek colonizers and finally to Rome and the longest period of exile. Human beings seem to be less territorial than many other animals, able to leave their homes and settle almost anywhere on earth. Most seem to feel strong emotional attachment to place, which for many will be their birthplace, where generations of ancestors lived before them. For others, it can be somewhere they have chosen, or to which they have been forced to move, far from where they were born. And it's this willingness to move on and settle elsewhere that enabled our species to cover, and the dreams that many held. I wonder whether hope would have survived with the same fervor if life in the Golan had been more consistently secure. The most religious might have retained their devotion, but the modern Zionist movement that established the Yishuv and went on to win statehood was dominated by largely secular elements that reacted explicitly to the degradation and persecution experienced time and again in the Golan. Be that as it may, this flame of hope of reviving Israel as a free people in its land did survive the millennia of exile and came to fruition, as our liturgy puts it, a wonder our eyes have seen. And the still very young state has achieved great things in so many fields in the face of daunting challenges and constant threats. Yet still, peace and security evade us, as they seem always to, almost always anyway, to have eluded our Israelite ancestors. Today we welcome visitors who have served Israel and suffered in that service, something most of us here have not experienced. And this brings into question our relationship as diaspora Jews to Israel. It's a great pleasure to welcome our visitors, but it's not a sacrifice. Not, for example, like leaving our diaspora homes and making aliyah. Are we, as Donald Trump has claimed recently, less supportive of Israel than evangelical Christians? As a young man, I made aliyah and lived and worked in Israel with every intention of remaining permanently. But in the end, I returned to the UK. So these questions are always on my mind, usually pushed to the back by daily pressures and preoccupations, but today, or when visiting Israel, brought very much to the forefront. In the 1960s, when I first went there, Zionism seemed a much simpler concept. Israel was still seen as the underdog in the conflict with its neighbors and enjoyed widespread sympathy and support. Its image was of an egalitarian, austere, and fiercely democratic society. Reality was probably never quite so simple, but that was the atmosphere I encountered, when power lay with the secular left of center, and though accounting for less than 5% of the population, the kibbutz movements were still punching very much above their weight, especially in politics and the armed forces. How very different things are now. Israel is a developed country, a developed economy, with its own tax exiles. The gap between the richest and the poorest is far wider. The armed forces struggle with recruitment to combat units, while privileged youngsters take cramming courses to improve their chances of doing their army service in a cyber unit. The numbers and influence of the ultra-religious have increased dramatically, and the political landscape has been radically transformed, with the old center-left establishment consigned to the political wilderness and elements that were on the outermost right-wing fringes now entering government. Whatever one's personal view of all this, it's made the relationship of Israel to the diaspora more complicated. People could once feel that they were doing their bit. People could once feel that they were doing their bit by dropping small change in a Karen Kayemet collection box in their home, and the young could enjoy the romance of a summer working in a kibbutz. But such things have little to do with current Israeli reality. There were always conflicting views of what Zionism should mean, what sort of state Israel should be, and of course, who is a Jew. Israel's earlier leaders were pragmatic in these respects, and the wonderful Declaration of Independence is a masterpiece of inclusivity. Its signatories spanning a broad range of the Yeshuv's political, cultural, and religious leadership, Ashkenazi and Sephardi, and from communists to conservatives. Sadly, it's impossible to imagine any document of such significance being approved and signed by such a wide spectrum of today's Israel. As Reform Jews, we are painfully aware that our fellow progressives in Israel have fought a constant battle for recognition and equitable treatment through bodies such as Iraq, that members of this community regularly support. Now the small victories that were won with huge effort face being overturned as the religious right seeks to delegitimize all but the most orthodox, and in particular to reject non-orthodox converts. Something that to me seems utter madness. We are also aware of the rise in word and deed of anti-Semitism, often hiding behind a mask of anti-Zionism. So how should we react? Many, sadly, have abandoned all involvement with their Jewishness, let alone with Zionism and Israel. But history suggests that assimilation offers little protection from anti-Semitism, and anyway, it's not an option for those of us who choose to cherish our Jewish identity. I believe we should strengthen our engagement with Israel, which is much more significant and much more enduring than any one moment in its history or any individual government. Although our stake is nowhere near that of those who make their lives there, and I'm happy that one of my sons has gone to make his home in Tel Aviv recently, we need not feel that our engagement must be uncritical. Kol Yisrael arevim zeh b'zeh. All Israel is responsible for one another is true, because whether we like it or not, Israel's fate is bound up with our own. Israel is affected by the degree of support it receives from the diaspora, and diaspora Jews are affected by Israel's actions and its fortunes. Moreover, from our very beginnings, as illustrated by Jacob's story, there's been coming and going between Haaretz, the land, and the diaspora. Welcoming today's guests is one small but positive act in expressing this bond. Let's seek to build on that and pray as we do each week. We left it out today, but usually we pray for wisdom and understanding among Israel's leaders and for peace.